No, it's not Canadian.
Canadian. Ah, interesting. I bet you don't get that. Yeah. Yes, we are recording. We are actually streaming. We are now live on YouTube. We are recording it and we're going to send this out. So anyone who's registered will get a copy of the recording sometime tomorrow. So let's get started. So hello, hello. Let's go back to the front, Mary
Oops.
Pat.
Yeah, there we
Yeah,
go.
that's it. That is what we are talking about today. Hello and welcome. It is very early here in Sydney. It is 7 a.m. My name is Danielle Stein Fairhurst. I'm a financial modelling specialist and I love bringing these events which are relevant to financial modelers about any topics relating to Excel and financial modelling. So today we are joined by Mary Pat Campbell. Where are you in the world, Mary Pat, and what time is it for you?
Well, it's 5 p.m. and I'm in North Salem, New York.
Okay,
Uh,
very,
so it's a little hot over here
yeah,
too.
very civilized time of day for you. That's great. So we run these all at very different times of day, depending on who the speaker is and what suits their schedule, so that people can join or they can catch up with the recording. So Mary Pat is an actuary who specializes in life insurance and annuities, and she has the most marvelous obsession with mortality rates, Excel errors, all of that stuff. I love following her. I'm going to pop a link to her Substack in a minute because she's got a podcast. And I listened to that recently, Mary Pat. It's a
Which
wonderful,
one?
yeah, it's wonderful to get a little insight into your world. So, you are going to talk today about managing spreadsheet risk in financial models. If you are joining us live, just jump any questions or comments and things in the chat. Any sort of more enduring questions will go in the Q&A. So I will be monitoring that. So just jump in with any questions or comments as you go, and fantastic. Thanks, everyone. Uh-huh. Yes, yes. Thanks, John. Yes, lots of comments there. I'll let you. I'll hand it over to you, Mary Pat, and let you take it away.
Okay. So managing spreadsheet risk in financial models, and I did open it up for those who came in early. There will be some memes in the presentation. No, I didn't create any of these. I get these, it's meme culture, which is steal, oh, I mean, copy the good ones. When you accidentally break a link in Excel, and of course you get ref errors or reference errors all over the place. But of course, the most deadly errors in Excel are the ones you don't see and you don't get any error messages at all. I'm going to talk,
Exactly.
yeah,
I love
right.
seeing errors. I'd much rather see an error than a
Yeah.
number that looks like it's right when it's completely.
And
Mm.
actually, and so I'm not necessarily going to get into this too much. I have told people about this when I design spreadsheets. Like, do you want it to break ugly or silently? And sometimes I do want it to break silently when it's a spreadsheet I give to other users, but a lot of times I want it to break ugly so that I know when something's gone wrong, like red and error messages propagate throughout the system. So then I can trace it back to where it is. But um, this is what's going to be in the presentation today. I don't want to scare you away. I do know that there are some actuaries that signed up for this because, of course, I promoted this and I have a huge network among actuaries. I will be talking about actuarial standards. If you're going to try to put this down as professionalism, uh, uh, continuing education, well, okay, I'll leave it to your conscience. You tell me what you think. There will be practical tips about dealing with spreadsheets and best practices or just good enough practices that will help you catch errors or prevent errors, which is, of course, better. And then the horror stories, because I have a long association with the European Spreadsheet Risks Interest Group. I actually spoke at one of their conferences back in, I think, 2010 or 2011 and in the UK. And it's a group of individuals. We like collecting stories from the news of spreadsheets gone awry, or really, I should say, it's not the spreadsheets, but spreadsheet use or the interaction between humans and spreadsheets.
Mm.
And some of those will be in this presentation.
Everybody
Uh,
loves to hear about these horror stories, don't they? They love to, I
yeah,
think Excel bashers. Oh, you shouldn't use Excel because these errors and the formulas break and all of that stuff. They love hearing.
well, and you have to think about why people use Excel in the first place, because yeah, I hear this from my fellow actuaries, and I am a fellow of the Society of Actuaries. Why are you using Excel? You should use R, you should use Python, you should use our proprietary software, that kind of thing. But people forget a lot of, oops, sorry, the reason that we use Excel. And I was talking with someone else in the insurance industry. It's like the dark matter of the financial industry, because we do have all of these different systems, but they don't play well with each other. And the flexibility of Excel lets you take data from one, do some transformations and calculations and then shove it into another system. Like we have our actuarial models. We take data from, like, say, our policy systems, put it into our actuarial models, and then what gets put out, sometimes it gets put into the ledger, like reporting reserves and that kind of thing. So Excel has a flexibility that allows us to work between these systems because the other systems don't necessarily hook up with each other very well. And
Kurt
that's true whether
calls
it's
it
an accountant or an
deadly.
actuary or, whatever.
Kurt calls it deadly flexibility.
Yeah.
Mm.
And if you clamp down too much and the deadliness is that it's really not a controlled environment, right? But if you put way too many controls on it, then people don't use it and they'll get around your controls anyway. So let's try to figure out how we can make it workable for everybody. So yes, actuarial standards and models and spreadsheets, trying not to be scary about it. Really, we're not scary. So hi, you can see my face. Sometimes I do presentations like this and my face is not on the screen. You just hear a disembodied voice. So I'm also called MEEP. That's a nickname of mine. Member of European Spreadsheet Risks uh, Interest Group. I'm an actuary and I have to follow the ASOPs. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. So what's an actuary? Oh, isn't this lovely AI generated art? Yes, obviously. So I'm going to make it simple. We quantify risks in certain ways. So yeah, people have heard, okay, quants, okay, fine, but they're contingent risks. So I do life insurance and annuities. So it's mortality, life contingent risks. When are you going to die? Okay, so that's a little morbid. But say property and casualty, it has stuff to do with like earthquakes, hurricanes, property damage, car crashes, that kind of thing. So we are putting dollar signs or Australian dollar signs or yen or whatever and trying to figure out um, lost costs and then what kind of premiums need to be charged so we can build up reserves to pay promises to cover those losses across an insured population. And we also work in pensions. So those are what actuaries generally do, though actuaries do go beyond insurance and pensions. They work in banking in Australia and other probabilistic modeling kinds of careers. And that's a lot of uncertainty around our models. So they get very complex. And yes, even though, yeah, we're supposed to use R or Python or very complex systems, we're often using Excel. And so this is something from real Batman comics. There was a issue story with a villain named the Actuary, who was caught counting cards in one of Penguin's casinos. And so he comes to the Penguin with this brilliant idea to do a heist. And I'm not going to tell you what the heist is. I'm just going to tell you that it was foiled by Batman, of course. And his client, so we here have the actuary, his client is not very happy that it failed. And of course, Penguin says, a wise man once said there are three kinds of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And the actuary says, I was working with flawed data. And my title is What Happens When You Don't Follow ASOPs. And I keep saying ASOPs. What are these ASOPs? The actuaries on the call know what ASOPs are. These are the actuarial standards of practice. And so I put a link here, and I believe, Danielle, you were going to share the
Yeah.
slides with yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna just
Yeah,
I'm gonna pop your links in
you can put that in the
yeah,
chat
as you're talking, I'm just gonna pop the link
yeah.
and
So
I'll make the slides available.
yeah, so I'm being very American centric here. The actuarial standards of practice, this list or this link, this is for the US. But like every national actuarial group has something like this, where we have professional standards that we have to follow in our work. Now, what's interesting about this, though, a lot of them are very specific to our work in terms of setting reserves, doing the valuations and the kind of very specific actuarial work. However, my three favorite ASOPs, actuarial communications, data quality, and modeling, you could use. I mean, so you could go to that page. So ASOP 41, ASOP 23, and ASOP 56, which is actually one of the newest standards of practice, are generic enough and high level enough. Basically, anybody who does this kind of work, especially financial modeling, you could especially use the data quality and modeling standards of practice because it gives you guidelines of best practices, more or less, of what you need to do to have reliable work, thorough work, in this kind of modeling. Now, I'm just giving you some example slides of what somebody did. This comes from a specific presentation about something specific, and this was a professionalism talk this comes from. And you'll see there's all sorts of ASOPs here, and there's ASOP 23, data quality, misnumbered ASOP 41, actuarial communications, and ASOP 56, modeling. It has items on data selection and confirmation, assumption selection, and confirmation, stuff that you need to think about: model design, model validation, model documentation, classification of models by risk. So that's the modeling ASOP. And then there are ones that are very actuarial: 10, 22, and 54. This is very regulatory, very actuarial. So this is all actuarial standards. But my point is to actually have some standards. One of the biggest problems with Excel use, spreadsheet use, whatever, data science in general. So I've talked data science or financial modeling. A lot of people don't even have any kind of standards.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a group in the UK. Okay. These were more from and actuaries like to make fun. I'm sorry, I'll just tell you, actuaries like to make fun of accountants. So this is from an accounting group. I'm just letting you know, my middle sister's CPA is an accountant in North Carolina. So they came up with a whole course and standards for financial modeling, which can also, and their examples are shown in spreadsheets. And it's actually very good. Now, the kinds of models they have, it's a little rigid for my actuarial modeling that I do, the kinds of models I do. But like I'm not necessarily, yeah.
Actually,
I'm
Mary
sorry.
Pat, we've actually got a session coming up in a couple of weeks on
Oh, okay.
20 principles for good spreadsheet practice.
Yeah, so it's based off of this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll pop a link in there as well. People might want to.
Yeah, that's, I mean, and it's a good standard. My point is to have a standard. It doesn't need to be, and you might develop it that's appropriate to what you're doing. I mean, I came up with a very simplified model, sorry, of, of a financial spreadsheet. You have input, you're doing some kind of calculation and transformation of that input, and then you get output. This is actually the structure I have on this talk of where things can go wrong. Things can go wrong when you're bringing in data. Things can go wrong when you have your calculations and transformations, and then you get your final output, and something may look awry at that point. At each step, you may want to put in checks and controls at each step, something where there's data validation and data checks at your input level, something to check for your calculations and transformations, something to check on your output. And so I'm going to be talking about that. This is more complicated this again, this is from the actuarial presentation I was talking about. They were talking about their model controls and checks of the degree of rigor and the different, so they have their input validation, calculation validation, and output validation. So this is an elaboration of what I just showed you for an actuarial model. And you do much more involved checks, for much more important numbers. And I'll just give a story. I used to be a valuation actuary for a reinsurance company, and one of my direct reports was getting upset about some work we were doing. And she came to me and like, oh, the number was off by like $16,000 or something. And we're at a point in the reporting cycle. I'm like, I don't want to hear about an error less than $1 million. Okay. So
Relative.
yeah, so you need to know what your thresholds are for errors. I mean, in financial modeling, when it's financial reporting for reserves, which is already an estimate of what amount of money you have to hold to cover insurance promises. So this is the aspect of actuarial work versus, say, accounting of how much money came in, how much money is going out. That's a little more exact versus how much money do we have to hold in reserve for an insurance promise. That's kind of got error bars around it. And I need to know within a certain, there's some wiggle room. $16,000 was not material, but even in accounting, there's like material errors. A few pennies might not mean anything, but for other transactions, it is meaningful. So you have to know what is meaningful, what is serious. I'm going to show you some serious errors in a moment. So yeah, so you need to know what is important for what you're using the spreadsheet for, or any model, whether it's a spreadsheet or not. Okay, so now
Before
we're
we
getting,
move on,
yeah,
Mary
go ahead.
Pat, we've got
Yeah,
a bit of discussion in the chat
okay.
about
Oh yeah, I just see there's
Bayesian.
22. What's going on here?
Yeah. About one curious to know whether you have had much experience or see much with Bayesian networks and Monte Carlo simulations. Is that
Okay, I did that in a spreadsheet once. It's not a great idea, but I've done it in all sorts of systems. So what is the issue with
Oh no, just
that?
asking whether you use that in
Oh
actuarial.
yeah, I've done it in the work. And so one of the issues, like in actuarial work, you have to actually you have to be able to replicate the random path.
Mm.
So either you have to save every simulation you did in the Monte Carlo, and I've done that, or you have to be able to replicate it because, of course, random number generators are not random. They're
Mm.
algorithms that will generate the random path. So you have to keep your random seed and everything to be able to replicate the exact result that comes out. That's for actuarial work. I've been involved with some of the regulations around what's called principles-based reserving, where you have to do that kind of random, do the Monte Carlo simulation. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and so there's various reserving approaches where you have to do stuff like that. And be able to replicate results. It does get very complicated. It's not great to do it in spreadsheets, by the way. I
Yeah,
did that once
yeah.
and crashed people's email of like top executives at TIAA. That was a bad thing. I can tell that story at the end if we have time. Okay, input validation. I actually wrote an article on it. I can send it to you, Daniel. You might get a laugh out of it. Input validation. Moving on. So I did split it up into different parts because I have horror stories for each of the parts. You may remember this story from October 2020 when a bunch of COVID tests got lost in the UK because of limits in importing data into Excel.
Yes,
What
I remember that.
you might remember, because Matt Parker, you may know him from Stand Up Maths, and he's done a lot of books. They're very funny to try to popularize math. He's got YouTube accounts, and and there's a link to this. I'm not going to play this right now, of where he covered it multiple times. This is what happened. They were supposed to send, I think it was in CSV files, the comma separated value files of the test results. So these are just text files. can be any length, but the way they were importing it in was into .xls files. Okay, the old Excel format, which is much smaller than the current, but even if it was the current, but also I think like it was a columns thing, not just a rows thing. And they lost a whole bunch of reported test cases. So this was 16,000. And I will this is something called, this is actually one of the most basic input data validation that, like, when I heard about this with regards to doing this for actuarial modeling, the simplest thing is called policy count. When we're pulling in policy data to do reserves and that kind of thing, the first thing we do is, well, how many policies were in the system? And then how many policies did we have in our actuarial model? Do they equal? That sounds so basic. Like, why wouldn't they equal? Well, because of something like this. Something screwed up in transferring your input. And it happens more often than you think, because something got screwed up in one of your records. Because the system that has your original records doesn't match up with your assumptions of how those things look in the model that you created. And it happens a lot in Excel because of the next thing I'm going to show you, which is how genes and other data, because this happens to me all the time, get changed into dates. This happens to me when I get mortality data, because it'll be 1-4 for the age group 1 to 4 years old, or say 5 to 9, 5-9, and it gets transformed automatically into a date. I'm going to tell you right now that it's actually in your settings. After a lot of people have screamed to Microsoft about this, it's in the settings, and you can uncheck the box to automatically import, to automatically switch things into dates when you import things. But it goes beyond that. If you have something that looks like a number, it will change it into a number when it might be an ID that you really want to come in as text, as a string. So this is something that has happened a lot. This has happened in genetics. It's still going on. This is from 2023. They tried to get around it by changing the gene names so it doesn't look like a date in English. But the problem is there are other languages out there than English, and Excel has versions other than English. So that's why I gave examples other than English there.
I know, headspin, it's in other languages.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, there's ways to do data hygiene where you import stuff and you check, like, what's the data type? And here's one of the memes, like, Excel makes things difficult by making it easy, and Excel and me eating a fig, incorrectly assuming something is a date. And it's not just dates, that it's a number, that it's some other data type than what you originally intended. And it transforms, and there's some weird transformations that I've seen in importing data from other kinds of files. And just imagine, because now I'm trying Copilot in Excel, and that gives you some weird results sometimes if you combine the two of these things. So you got to be careful, because you have to put everything in a data table now. Use Copilot in Excel. Yeah. But this is very high level that I'm giving you, some practical tips for data or input validation. It's very simple, but it screws up more than you would think. Just the count of the data types. And so this is actually, that's the one I really look at a lot. Are there weird data types in the field? And I do checks like number of counts. Are there empty cells? Actually, I didn't even put this in here. Are there empty cells? Are there some weird characters? All sorts of kind of thing. This actually goes with ASOP 23 data quality. Data quality checks. You check the ranges. It's like doing the data validation when you do inputs, data validation is built in to Excel, but we think of that with manual inputs. Here I'm talking about data that you're importing from somewhere else that you might think it's safe because it's automatic, but you know, a lot of weird stuff can happen. And one of the data sets I like to look at, sometimes when it imports, like one of the columns at some point gets off by a column. It shifts. And I'm like, oh man, because someone encoded the original data improperly. And then I have to do a repair. A lot more manual crap than I originally expected. The whole point is originally you need to know your data and you should document it. Actuaries have, I'm sorry, I know of an actuarial malpractice lawsuit that involved like special coding where a category was coded 0, 1, or 2 for like it was a single, or there was a couple for a pension, or they were divorced, and someone still gets a pension benefit, and it was ignored in the valuation. And that should have been in the data dictionary, and that it was important for the valuation. So it's like, did you ignore data that you shouldn't have ignored? That kind of thing. A lot of it is, even before you do your model, do you know the data that's supposed to go into it and the quality of it? And is there anything that's going to be missing that you're going to have to deal with somehow? That's real life data. A lot of people think of data coming in as some pristine platonic ideal. And we often see this as actuaries, that there's a lot of dirty data that we have to fix somehow or deal with or get around. There's something called imputation, where you can put replacement values in for missing data. And this often happens in data science, but I have seen some awful approaches to imputation. So yeah, so I'm like injecting a little data science in here. This is not something that Excel causes, obviously. It's just the original data. But a lot of people, but I'll just tell you one. I saw this in Retraction Watch. Someone used autofill from Excel to impute missing values in his research. This is not a legitimate way to impute missing values. But because Excel made it easy, he thought this was something he could do. This was like an economist, or so. I forget where he was from. He had to retract that paper. It was awful.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, that was something I put up, and I was in one of my podcasts, I believe. It was one of the amazing things that I saw. Um, yeah, like yeah, it all starts with what your inputs are, before you even start calculating. But where the real fun happens, I don't know if you remember this one.
Yes.
This is from 2013. Yeah, it's an old ad, and I'm not going to make people guess what's wrong with this. The total of those numbers is not $9,000, by the way.
Yeah.
This is a common error with sums, that the sum did not cover the entire numbers. Actually, usually there's a little green triangle in the corner alerting you that you're missing some cells, okay? It's missing the surf rentals and other excursions, if I remember correctly, in this total. Um, uh, and it's Microsoft's own ad. They got it wrong.
Wow.
And this is an experience I had myself at TIAA. The marketing people put out some brochures that had wrong numbers in it. So then they had to send their brochures to the actuarial department, marketing brochures, for us to check the numbers before they sent them out.
Yeah.
But then they sent us a memo: do not check the grammar or anything like that. That didn't stop us, by the way.
Oh, of course.
We still did. They probably ignored everything we said that wasn't numbers,
Mm.
which was okay. But they couldn't stop us anyway. We were going to do it. But this is the real notorious one, which is the London whale
Yes.
disaster. Yeah, this is the trading desk, where there was this just I shouldn't say out of control, huge revenues doing trades. And then one day it lost a lot of money, and they had to do a post-mortem of what went wrong. What really went wrong is there were no legitimate controls and good governance structure over this area, over this trading area, because they were bringing in so much money. That was what really what went wrong. But one of the things is like the risk management function was this spreadsheet, which they had this VAR, value at risk metric, that they calculated improperly. That this was supposed to be a limit that they were not supposed to exceed, and they divided by the sum of two numbers instead of the average of two numbers. And their volatility metric was off by a factor of 2. Now, this is not what caused the problem any more than a copula's caused the credit meltdown and the mispricing of CDO squareds, if you know what I'm referring to, in the great financial crisis. There was a lot of governance issues going on because they also said this spreadsheet, because this wasn't the only thing in the spreadsheet, was a spaghetti logic mess. And the person who was in charge of the spreadsheet was a very junior person. So if you know kind of how that whole thing goes.
Yeah, people often think that spreadsheeting or modeling is a junior thing because it's seen
Yeah.
as, oh, it's just Excel, but it's quite a dangerous thing,
No, I mean, they didn't have a real risk man. It wasn't independent of the desk. They were just doing it for show. I mean, I'm just saying, from a realistic standpoint, it really wasn't the spreadsheet's problem.
Yeah.
It makes for a good horror story, $6 billion in trading losses. But the truth of the matter was nobody had an independent risk management function that was overseeing what this trading desk was doing. They had no real, I mean, it could have been fine to you. This is a materiality thing, of course. Like, how did they have such exposure? Nobody was really measuring the exposure they had. It had nothing to do with spreadsheets, is what I'm trying to get at.
Mm.
But I do put it in here because this is something that was supposed to be very crucial, right? So who was checking this? Nobody was checking this. And I think a lot of us who have worked in spreadsheets know this. And this was why I got into all of this kind of, how do I put checks and controls in my own spreadsheets? Because nobody else is checking them.
Yeah.
I think we've all had that experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I need to learn how to build robustly to prevent errors from getting into the spreadsheet. Okay. And this is just a couple of tips. I think a lot of us already know some of this, but if you don't want to really
I mean, when you're
know,
building, as you're building
yeah.
the formula, just always thinking like, who is the person who's going to have to understand this, and what could possibly go wrong, to always be thinking of it as you're building the formula.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, I always do this with regards to, a lot of us do spreadsheets like, oh, this is just a throwaway.
Yeah.
I'm not going to have to use it again. But at a certain point, you might start realizing it's at a size that, like, this is not merely a throwaway. I need to think about the structure a little more. So this is why having good structure, like the relative versus absolute references, making sure your lookups, because we use a lot of lookups. We have a lot of, try to minimize the different kinds of formulas so that if you were an R1C1, if you know what I'm talking about, R1C1, that you don't have too many different looking formulas, so that you have the absolute and relative references set up. That means you can copy paste across a row or across an entire region, and you've got your formula there. And I have a lot of spreadsheets that are structured that way, because it's like years across, maybe age groups going down. We have something called loss triangles of like calendar year, accident year,
One
that
single
kind of thing.
formula. Yes. Do you?
And sometimes you have one single formula across a row,
Yeah.
or maybe for an entire matrix. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the reasons one of the many reasons I really enjoy the new dynamic arrays is just because of that. Like it forces you to have
Yeah. Yeah,
some.
I like the array. Yeah, I like the array, the current array functions and that kind of thing. But you really need to make sure you understand how these functions work and also how they break.
We've got a
Um,
very, I don't know whether he's baiting me, but John has got a comment in the chat. He says, I think indirect is absolutely wonderful. I'm not
well,
a I'm not a big fan of indirect, but it,
Well, I'm not a fan of indirect, but sometimes it's difficult to get around. I'm about to actually use a spreadsheet tomorrow with indirect that somebody else built. And a lot of us have to use spreadsheets that other people built.
it can be
And I
hard
know
to
how indirect,
work.
yeah, and
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
know how indirect works, but it's a very dangerous function to use.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and it's because of something that we have used before and we're using it for lookup purposes.
Mm,
And anyway, we structured it a certain way.
yeah,
Um, and on top, so so it's just it's we're trying to avoid spaghetti, situations.
yeah.
And of course, we're trying to avoid mega formulas. The one I had here. I did not build this. Someone else gave this to me, and it was
Okay.
really a real like cash balance tension. Um, I used to I
This is a real example.
This
Holy,
is a real example. So in one of the actuarial discussion forums, we had a whole thread where we shared the live ones that we came across because we're often using and reusing spreadsheets from hell. And I did a couple newsletter articles called like, horrors gallery of Excel formulas.
yeah.
Um, and asking people to send them in. I got some from the European Spreadsheet Risk Interest Group too, and looking around. Um, but yeah, and you can see there's some index matches and
So
oh
we've
my
got
God.
people saying lots of emojis. Doesn't mean you can. It does just because you can doesn't
No,
mean
you
you
can,
should.
doesn't mean you should.
Straight to
Yes, if it's
jail.
Jurassic Park,
Yeah,
yeah,
you've
just
been to
like
named range. I think they could probably
switch
use
up both of them.
a let function is when you're wanting to do something where it seems here like they're repeating the same thing over and over again. So a let can help you
I
to
mean,
to reduce it. Like the name is so long, it just
y-
makes it even.
yeah, I mean it's using yeah, so this cash balance schedule. No, actually it's worse than you think. There's two cash balance schedules here.
Oh,
There's cash balance schedule and cash balance schedule 2.
yeah.
So there's two different lookup tables that have to do with like how many years of service you have, of what the cash balance schedule is. I mean, this is bad. And there's a cap because I see a max there. Um,
Yeah.
oh my gosh. And there's an
Yeah,
option. If it's
break it
not equal
up
to
and
3,
yeah.
yeah, so anyway, I don't want to, there are ways to make it more readable.
Yeah.
Okay. But yeah, so there's ways to put checks in while you're building it. So you want to build it robustly. You want to build checks into your calculations. I mean, there's always footing, checking rows and columns. If that's the thing, if you're doing sums, that they sum to the same total. If that's the kind of table you're looking at, and we often are looking at tables like that, or income statements that behave the way they're supposed to, things foot, etc. Um, Sometimes I have more than one way to estimate something. And I remember one of my bosses when I was early on, he would see one of the things I calculated and he'd just look at it and tell me it's wrong. And I'm like, how did he know? How did he know that number that came out on my spreadsheet was wrong? He didn't even check it. But it's because he had an idea from experience of what the value should be. And there are kind of rough ways to estimate certain quantities in finance often. And you might have like ranges that the answer should be in. And if it's outside that range, you really need to look at it. Um, One of the things, something went negative that shouldn't. I had a direct report who had a DAC, which is something that is not supposed to go negative. Go negative. I'm like, that's not negative. You have to change your formula that if it goes negative, you have to set it to 0. So you have to change the formula. And there's other things like that. It can't go above a certain amount, below a certain amount, something that's amortizing, that kind of thing. And I often use conditional formatting so that errors pop out, because our visual response is, our visual cortex is just a huge part of our brain. Use it, if you can see, hey, hi, use it to your advantage. And I often do that like errors really pop out of the spreadsheet so I can see it, because often it's a sea of numbers or all sorts of things. I need it to jump out at me so I know where to go. Yes, you can go to special. Okay, I know we can use that, but it's helpful to have things. And sometimes I just use conditional formatting to do the min to max, that kind of thing, and I can see where the pain point is in my model. Okay. Um, Sometimes I do quick checks because I have overwritten formulas with numbers. So I toggle between the formulas and numbers. I mean, and seeing the numbers. If you have the formulas go and there's a number still there, you just hard coded something over your formula. These are just know what are common, what's your high frequency error? Like a lot of times, what doesn't update or refresh links to other files. That's really dangerous. Pivot tables sometimes don't refresh. Sometimes the thing doesn't totally calculate. Often I have to go into VBA to force the whole thing to recalculate. I've had to do that to make it march cell to cell to calculate each cell. That's very slow, by the way. But I've had to do that with some spreadsheets. And VBA code, of course, is very dangerous. It can do all sorts of things, but this is high frequency errors. And manual processes, of course, can always inject errors into your spreadsheet when you're anything in your process. There's high frequency and then there's high severity. So where's the pain point in your spreadsheet, or where's the biggest impact of a change in like a calculation or a formula or something like that? And that's where you really should look hard in auditing the formula and that kind of thing. So like when I have a VBA macro or anything like that, or you were mentioning let, or some kind of formula that might be very complicated, or a transform that's a little involved, that's the one that you really need to look at the most, compared to anything else. So just stopping real quick before we move on to our output. Any comments?
Lots of comments in the chat. Calvin saying, what about Power Query transformation such as M code?
Yeah,
I mean, I think
yeah,
this applies, doesn't it? You still need to check it, and same sorts of more.
yeah. I mean, a lot of it is how are you using the stuff? So a lot of the stuff with Power Query, and when I mentioned pivot tables, like I don't use pivot tables in what I call production. I use it for exploratory data analysis. And I use it as a way to think about how I'm going to set up something that I'm going to use over and over and over again. Um, that's one of the things I about died when I saw someone was using a pivot table to set up reserves for the annual statement. And I'm just like, but I don't, and this is what often happens. We're not given time to build it correctly. So when that happened, I had to put all sorts of checks. This is the output testing. Actually, this is perfect segue. I had a spreadsheet where I considered what was being used to transform the inputs, which was all of our different reinsurance treaties. I'm just saying this is what it was. And it was split out by the different reserve bases and all these different things. And it was aggregated via pivot table. And it was going to be set up for, what is it? Exhibit, whatever, the reserve 5. And it was using a pivot table. So I had to put in all sorts of checks to make sure things added up to the right numbers for the output. So here we go, ASOP 56. This is modeling and about testing. So model testing, model output validation, a review by another professional, reasonable governance and controls of your process, which I didn't really have, and mitigating misuse and misinterpretation. So this last one, this might be more actuarial than others. So one of the things we get very paranoid about people using our stuff for the wrong thing. And that's often what happened. I about freaked out. Someone got a hold of my spreadsheet once and was using it with clients. And I'm like, who told, how did that get out there? And I found out another actuary sent it from within our organization. I'm like, I didn't tell you you could send it to them. Yeah, so the problem is, of course, spreadsheets really aren't locked down too much. You can break passwords. I can break passwords. Anyway, I lock cells without a password to prevent inadvertent changes. So that's one of the things I do when it gets out of my hands. A lot of times we can't get a peer review from another professional. I've done peer reviews of other people's spreadsheets, okay? But one of the things that I do is a lot of times you're going to forget. And in actuarial work, some of our work is only annually. So I peer review my work the next year. So I get the spreadsheet back and I build for myself next year. So I'm trying to be nice to future me by documenting, etc., because I'm not going to be looking at it for like at least 9 months once I finish this year's work. So, that's often what happens. So sometimes it's, I mean, I'm exaggerating. A lot of us, maybe it'll be, you'll look at something twice a year, or we do quarterly reporting or something like that. So it depends on the spreadsheet. And that's why we want to document everything. So that's actuarial, a standard of practice 41, actuarial communications, which has to do with documentation. So I do have links to some of my resources. I mean, these were very high level kinds of advice, but a lot of the times it's, yeah, so here's the horror stories and the best research and best practices from the European Spreadsheet Risks Interest Group, because I found them like back in 2005, I believe, because I was just maybe even 2004. I was really just pulling my hair out with the spreadsheets I was having to deal with from other people. And I mean, when I started as a newbie in 2003, that's when I learned Excel, but also I wanted to build properly because I had come from a background where I learned real computer science and how to program, properly with structure. And I was getting these hideous spreadsheets, and spreadsheets really are programming. So where are the standards? Where's the structure? And this is how I found this group back then. And they had the papers of how do you know your spreadsheet is right? That was the first paper I found. That's the title of it, by Phil Berwick. And he had a bunch of tips of how to structure and document your spreadsheets way back, even before Excel 2007. And I'm like, okay. And so I started doing these practices. Having standards, like high level standards, has really helped. That you have to test your spreadsheet. How does it break? Is the input coming in good? How are the formulas working? And one of the things I often do is what breaks my spreadsheet. If I don't know how it breaks, then I don't know how it works. What inputs will break it? And so that's actually something I often test. What are the limits of that might not be the appropriate question depending on what kind of spreadsheet model you're working on. But it's like, what kind of outputs are not appropriate? So that's like the output validation. Okay. The whole input to output. And this review by another professional, again, a lot of times, unfortunately, I don't have that. or not to the level I would like. What can I say? Yeah, checklist manifesto. I don't know if you've heard of this, but this is like flight crews, surgical teams have all improved their safety records via checklists. And I have started putting checklist tabs, whether it's me for spreadsheets that have complex processes. A lot of them don't have complex processes, but the ones that do, I will put check, especially if it's a spreadsheet that I use only once a year. I'm going to forget how to use it. And yes, the memes. I like my memes. What can I say? Um, and let's see. And then for mine, yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. And my Substack, I do get into mortality, but also public finance, primarily US public finance, and then some other stuff. I also have another Substack that's on sumo stats. But I did have 2 podcast episodes on people doing stuff with spreadsheets that they shouldn't have. And I believe I do have the guy who used autofill in there, that shouldn't have used autofill. Uh, Spreadsheets are a tool, they're a fancy calculator. It doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, but you should use them properly. You should use all of your tools properly. That's really the thing. Get some standards. You can use the actuarial ones, they're free. And I've been trying to tell the data science people, if you guys don't develop your own standards, you can use ours. Ours are free.
Yeah.
There are, and by the way, there really are consequences to actuaries for not following our standards. We can get disciplined, which is up to getting kicked out of our societies and losing our designation. So that's like getting disbarred, or it does happen. Now it doesn't happen to very many actuaries. It's very serious when it does happen. But it has happened for actuaries who did not follow. Most of the time, the kinds of discipline that occurs is that they say, don't do that again, you're going to get extra training, or they get suspended for 2 years or something like that. And they're required to do extra education and yada yada. But it's not a good look. We try to hold ourselves to high professional standards and high ethical standards. And I did write on actuarial standards of practice. I wrote one when ASOP 56 came out, the modeling ASOP. Even though it's kind of funny, we've done modeling for so long, we didn't actually have an actuarial standard of practice on modeling, but we finally came out with one, and it went into effect, I believe, in 2021. And then ASOPs 23 and 56, distrust and verify, had to do with some stuff that I had written before, and that was also, I believe, in podcasts of falsified data in research that involved auto insurance. That I'm like, well, I shouldn't. I was a sucker to have believed it. And here is how it relates to our actuarial standards of practice. So, there's a lot of people who had believed it, and then it was found out to be a fraud. Yay. So, and a lot of people are finding out a lot of research has been a fraud or not replicable, not necessarily a fraud, but some research not replicable. Oh, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, the Checklist Manifesto is a very good book.
Yeah.
I'm very, very, very pro checklist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been absolutely fascinating to get an insight into the actuarial mind and how that applies to modelers. It's all very similar. The standards for actuaries are, they're good practices for a reason, and we can definitely apply those to financial modeling. And as I always say, the only thing you know, that you should definitely be worried about having errors in your model. And the only thing worse than finding the error, not finding it.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
It's the client calling you.
Yes.
We've
Or your
had that.
client finding
No,
the
I'm sorry. The worst thing is the client calling you and having found the error,
yeah.
which it wasn't my error. Sorry, but I was the one who had to fix it. Okay. I've been in that position.
It's just embarrassing when that happens.
Yes, because I'm part of a team. Okay. We're
Yeah.
part of a team. I mean, and I've worked at, I'm not saying who, when, where, or how. Okay. I'm just saying, I have been in multiple situations, different in different situations where I have found, and some of the cases I found an error and had to report up the chain, and it was material. There were cases where the client found the error and we had to fix it.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter who caused the error, frankly, because it's our organization
Mm.
and we got to make it right. And this is, and I mean, we're all professionals here because of the network that this goes out on. But I have taught at the University of Connecticut in the actuarial science program. I don't now, but like about 10 years ago. And I taught the computing class, the Excel and Microsoft Access and the VBA for Excel. And I told the students, I'm giving you these kinds of assignments, and I try to make them somewhat actuarial, but not too hard. And you get grades in this kind of thing. However, in the real, and I'm like, I'm trying to teach you like you would work for me. However, in the office, I don't give you an assignment in right or wrong and you get a grade. I'm going to make you do it, or someone's going to do it until it's correct. 80% is not good enough. Sorry. It's going
Yeah.
to be 100% by the time it's leaving my hands. And if it's me who has to do, fix it, I'm really not going to be happy about that.
Yeah, I mean, you can't trust if someone is constantly producing things that contain errors, you can't really trust their work, and you sort of lose credibility.
Yeah.
So,
And and this is one of the reasons that as a profession, we promulgate these standards.
mm,
And and other actuaries who might be on the call, can we really pound these into people's heads? We do have in the US, and I'm sorry, any actuaries from other organizations, they probably have professionalism, continuing education requirements as well, not just the US. Um, in these in these requirements, they are required to listen to these standards and listen to what we're required to do, and that we are bound to have very high quality work. Okay, we are expected to do this, and it's kind of like a whole culture. And if we find out that you're going to be sloppy, I'm like, no, you're not going to work for me.
yeah,
Are you
sloppy.
trying to, yeah, it's just like, nope. And this is one of the things, like, where people are doing freakouts over some of the AI tools coming out now.
Mm, mm,
You're like, okay, we'll do it for, some of the fluff wordsmithing, but they don't work very well with numbers, have you noticed
yeah,
so far? So if I'm having to, I might as well do it myself if it's not really generating the numerical stuff very well. I
mm,
mean, we're going to have to check it anyway.
mm.
Eh,
Mary Pat, we are out of time. It's
oh yes, I know. I'm like, I
just
kind of noticed that too. Yes.
I could talk to you all day.
Yeah.
We are going to
Oh,
have.
I could talk about errors. I mean, we've got a lot more, and I'm going to send Danielle, I'm going to send you the specific story, and then maybe we can talk more about the how I crashed all the executives' email boxes.
Ah!
Another, it's a great story.
We must do this again sometime. So
Yeah.
thank you so much,
Okay.
everybody, for all your fantastic participation in the chat.
Yes.
And of course, thank you so much, Mary.